From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters.
It is now my great honor to introduce the President-elect of the United States of America, Joe Biden.
It's the honor of my lifetime that so many millions of Americans have voted for that vision. And now, the work of making that vision is real. It's a task, the task of our time.
That is Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President-elect, and Joe Biden, the U.S. President-elect, speaking for the first time since their election win. In major cities across the U.S., crowds spilled onto the streets for hours to celebrate the win. And on a deeper level, for many, that celebration is about the end of the Trump presidency. The U.S. election is over, but the United States remains a deeply divided nation. The world is watching how the U.S. is bridging that divide. We turn to Edward Keenan, the Toronto Star's Washington bureau chief, who's been tracking and reporting on every moment of the U.S. election. Today, the Biden win, what it says about the U.S. and what it means for Canada. Ed, welcome back. What a difference a weekend makes.
Well, it sure does. What
can you say?
Like everything this year, you pack years worth of news and events, it feels like, into almost every day. And it's been like that since Election Day, which is a week ago almost as we speak.
We knew it would take days for a final result to come in what has been an unusual and complex election. And then it all sort of happened at once when the major news organizations called the win for Joe Biden. As a reporter, somebody who's been covering every twist and turn of this thing, what was your reaction to that moment when the world learned Joe Biden had won the election?
In a strange way, it was kind of anticlimactic at that moment because it had been heading that way for days. And it was becoming pretty obvious to almost everybody that Joe Biden had won. I think on election night itself, there was a sense where it seemed like a long shot, but if Biden had won Florida and Texas, we would have known that on election night and it would have been sort of over. When that didn't happen, we knew we were in for kind of a long haul, but watching the results come in, it was obvious which direction things seemed to be moving, and knowing which ballots were still outstanding, it seemed like Trump would need a kind of a miracle. The day before, like on Friday, I was in Philadelphia, outside the place where they were counting the ballots. And by early afternoon in Philadelphia there, the sort of like count every vote celebration or protest in the streets had turned into the people have spoken celebration. Back in Washington on Saturday, in the office here, watching on television very closely because I expected a call. And when it came, my immediate reaction was that I had a ton of work to do. I had to file a story about the end of the Trump era. I had to, make sure another story about sort of what it means for Canada was ready to go and all of that. And then I drove downtown in DC here to the area near the White House where tens of thousands of people were dancing in the streets. Many of our listeners might not know that, but the District of Columbia, Washington, DC, has 3 electoral college votes, and they voted well over 90%. I think it was 92.5% for Joe Biden. So Trump was not a popular figure here in Washington, DC among the residents. And there was a street party for the ages and a honking of horns all around the city. And so, my instinct was to go out and soak that up and report on it. And then also last night, I got a pretty decent night's sleep for the first time in a month. So
it's a bit of a restore to some version of sanity as a reporter.
Yeah. And I mean, my sleep or lack of sleep is more about the end of the election campaign in earnest. Although, there are some court challenges and there's a lot of transition business to take place. But as we speak, this many days after the election, in the past 2 weeks, I've been to 6 different states. I have spent a lot of time on the road writing about this and talking to people and all of that. So there's a real sprint for the campaigns and for the press at the end. And then a lot of tearing their hair out for the viewers and listeners and readers at home who are trying to figure out what's happening. There's a kind of a moment to breathe and maybe try and consider what some of this means.
So to you, what is the significance of Joe Biden becoming the next U.S. president?
Well, I mean, I think it's hugely significant. I think Donald Trump represented an anomaly in recent U.S. politics and a very particular sense of where the country should go. For those in the international community, including Canada, it was a real sort of might makes right withdrawal from international institutions, a high level of unpredictability and impulsiveness. That was true also for people at home. The end of that, at least for now, represents the possibility of a period of calm. I think also, if you consider two major crises, one immediate and one long term, that the United States and the world face, one being the COVID crisis and the other being climate change. Donald Trump had a almost denialist viewpoint on both, anti-science kind of approach on both issues. I think his sort of general sense was like, I think this is going to go away. It's not as big a problem as we make it out to be.
For the two biggest issues that we currently faced in 2020.
Yeah. And Joe Biden, in both cases, has said he's going to rely on science. He's going to rely on truth. We'll see how the policy framework plays out on that. But, immediately now in the transition period here, he's announced his team of advisors that he's planning to rely on the COVID situation. He's said he's calling governors to talk about mask mandates. And then on climate change, he has a fairly ambitious plan. He's going to let the UN know on his first day as president that he plans to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. Those are two giant existential issues on which, in this closely contested election, something massive turned for the United States and the world. And it's turned in a direction that I think many Canadians will greet with a sense of relief. And I think those are maybe representative of dozens and dozens of smaller issues, maybe smaller in existential terms, but very important to many people, on which the differences between the two are just as stark. This really was a fork in the road. It's hugely significant that Joe Biden has emerged as the winner.
In seeing the celebrations, and you were out there too, and the many people who flooded the streets in New York and in major cities, it seemed like the celebration was not just necessarily about a Biden win, but their idea of what America is. A lot of people said that this is an election about the concept of democracy in the United States. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I heard that from almost every Biden supporter I talked to. I asked people all around the country, Wisconsin, Texas, Florida, Atlanta, North Carolina, South Carolina, New Hampshire. As I traveled around the country all year, I asked almost everybody I talked to one question among many others that I asked. But what is this election really about if you boil it down? And the people who said that they were supporting Biden, almost all of them said that when you boil it down, it's about American democracy. It's about what the United States is. Trump supporters also believe that to some extent. I heard from them quite a lot, like America will never be a socialist country, that they were afraid that the country was changing too quickly, that the radical Democrats, this is Trump's language, had plans to overhaul things that would make them not recognize the country they lived in. So they had that sense, whether or not it was justified or not. But certainly on both sides, Biden's characterization that this is a battle for the soul of the nation didn't necessarily seem overblown. That's windy rhetoric, but it's also a characterization of how a lot of regular voters really believed this vote was about. And you see that in the record turnout for both sides. Donald Trump got more votes in this election than any Republican has ever gotten in an election ever. But Joe Biden got more votes in this election than any presidential candidate has ever gotten. In some states, the turnout of eligible voters reached 80% in a country where, a decade ago, people were complaining about apathy because, in presidential elections, it often was lucky to get 60%. When you saw in major cities, the dancing in the streets and sustained for hours. I mean, I joked that it was like somebody had won the World Cup in Toronto. Spontaneous celebrations in the streets lasted for 12 hours or more of people just spilling out there, honking their horns in their cars, dancing with strangers. That emotional reaction to what both sides agree is a pivotal election for the country.
We'll be right back.
Ed, you wrote a piece for the Toronto Star where you break down what this win and what a Biden presidency means for Canada. And we've talked about it on this podcast before, too. But let's start first with how perhaps the more personal relationship between the U.S. and Canada could change because of this. How do you think this election has changed how Canadians view the United States?
Like those people celebrating in the streets, a solid supermajority of Canadians, something like 75 or 80%, depending on the polls that you look at, and certainly the conversations that I have bear this out, had that same dancing in the streets celebration, right? That a fever that had overtaken their neighbor had somehow broken, and that maybe there's a path to things being okay, to them becoming the country we thought we knew and we thought we were friends with for a long time. You may be better positioned than me, but I've heard from a lot of Canadians a sense, though, the margin wasn't big enough necessarily for them to feel entirely comfortable. That the size of Trump's vote, that something like 47 or 48% of Americans turned out in record numbers to support Donald Trump. The questions they had about the United States, they persist because of that, because a lot of Canadians can't understand how anyone could still support Donald Trump after all of this. On a more practical level, government to government and all of that, I think we will see immediately a friendlier relationship between people in Canada's government and the people in the Biden administration. Biden has had warm feelings for Canada all along. His last official foreign visit as a vice president was to Ottawa. He talked there about the strength and importance of the relationship between Canada and the U.S. Certainly the Democratic administration, the current Liberal PMO, the Prime Minister's office and cabinet, will have a warmer relationship because they're ideologically more aligned. But I think Biden he's been a politician for a long time, and he's more of a central casting standard issue politician in the traditional statesman mode that prime ministers and presidents of both parties have had with each other through most of 20th and 21st century history. We'd expect to see that no matter what happens in Ottawa in a potential next federal election.
Right. From a government to government stance, there's a better idea of what the U.S. stands on and their expectations and what that relationship is versus 4 years of a Trump presidency of some days it could be very warm, some days it could be icy cold, it could be tariffs. There's more of perhaps a better read on what a Biden presidency could mean versus a Trump presidency.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a trade lawyer that I talk to a lot who talks about, tariffs by tweet or policy by tweet, that Donald Trump on any given day would sort of announce things out of the blue. He would be making a speech and he would sort of imply suddenly that Canada was the enemy. We'd see an executive order that suggests that Canadian imports to the United States represent a security risk. You'll remember even during this campaign, during this COVID crisis, there was a sudden suggestion that they might send troops to the northern border to secure it. I mean, all of that kind of stuff, it creates headaches in Ottawa and fires that need to be put out. And with the Biden administration specifically, but this would be true also if there were a different Republican president in almost all cases, you don't expect, and Canadians shouldn't expect, that suddenly Washington and Ottawa are going to be singing from the same songbook on every issue. They have different priorities, different concerns, and sometimes those are in direct conflict. And we'll see that right away with Keystone, I think. The pipeline.
Which Biden has said that he will cancel and...
That he'll cancel. And the Canadian government, the Alberta government are both very committed to seeing that bill. So, I mean, we're going to see these governments at loggerheads. But there's a more predictable way that this diplomacy plays out. There's a set of agreed upon rules and international institutions that adjudicate disputes. There are certain principles and predictable ways that these negotiations happen that Canadians kind of rely on as a smaller country. And Biden represents a sort of a return to that business as usual in that sense between the two countries. And Trump was intentionally and proudly disruptive of that entire order. But in the short term, Biden represents as I said, a return to business as usual. And it's a way of doing business that Canada has traditionally been comfortable with, whether we win in any given dispute or whether we lose.
I wanted to loop back to the Biden win itself. And on Saturday, we heard Joe Biden speak to the U.S. and to the world as the president-elect. What about his speech stuck out to you the most?
I think his theme is healing. And that was no surprise. It still stands out because it's really at the core of his mission and his mandate, literally in the sense of trying to heal a sick country in the middle of a pandemic at a time here during the week after the election where cases are at record level. But that's the immediate crisis. But then, he talks specifically about healing in the United States on a more psychological level, on a more existential level. And that in some ways is almost a bigger and harder job.
It's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, lower the temperature, see each other again. Listen to each other again.
It's a lot less measurable, certainly, and it's almost like he ran with the idea as uniter in chief. That's what he came off as in the speech.
And there's no panel of scientific experts who you can appoint to tell you how to bring together a polarized country. Barack Obama, who was perhaps one of the most gifted politicians you and I will ever live to see, promised, that there's no red America and blue America. There's a United States of America. And yet there was an uprising against his presidency while he was in office in the Tea Party movement and in right-wing media, and then in the obstructionism in the Republican Congress. That was the sort of deepest polarization most Americans have ever seen and recorded by pollsters. I mean, this is a difficult job. There are 70 million or something Americans who voted for Donald Trump. A Trump supporter in Philadelphia the other day, who was sort of part of the Stop the Count protest, said to me, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a Trump supporter and I'm with him. And I'm never going to accept the results of this election if Biden wins. And so that's sort of what he's up against. Some of it is specific to Trump. Some of it, though, was a deep polarization that had already set in this country before. And you see it really remarkably if you're driving around trying to just talk to people and gauge support. And if you look at that electoral map, what happens is if you're in a big city, you find people who really, really, really didn't like Trump and thought he was a threat to democracy. And if you drive an hour outside of the city, what you find is people whose houses are festooned with Trump paraphernalia and Make America Great Again flags and banners and garden displays. And when you talk to them, they're loyal to Donald Trump. And so at some level, Biden's biggest job, and that he's laid it out for himself, that he campaigned on, is trying to find a way to have the Americans stop hating each other.
And the vote total showed that it really wasn't a repudiation of Trump's politics. I mean, he still got, as we record this, more than 71 million votes. So there are still many Trump supporters, people who voted for him, despite all the scenes that we're seeing of people celebrating. This remains a deeply divided nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not as big a repudiation as a lot of people who really dislike Donald Trump wanted. I mean, this is still the second largest mandate that a Democrat has won in 30 or 40 years. Still a significant popular vote margin across the country for Biden. He still won Georgia, which hasn't been a Democrat state since 1992. I think he won Arizona, which has very seldom been a Democrat state in the last 80 or 100 years. It was to some degree a repudiation of Trumpism, because I think we can also see the people who voted against Trump really were voting against Trump more than anything else. So that's where I think there was a repudiation of Trump, but the majority who repudiated Trump is still up against a minority that's almost as big as they are, who are dug right in and who are ready to fight back.
Ed, thank you for all your reporting and analysis. You've been with us every step of the way, and by our count, this is actually our 9th episode with you about the election in about a month's time, maybe just a little bit over a month. So thank you for following this with us every step of the way. Appreciate the analysis.
I appreciate the opportunity to share it. It's always fun to talk to you guys and to you out there listening.
That's Edward Keenan, the Toronto Star's Washington bureau chief. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.